Hey everybody, welcome back to another Reasonable Price Prediction, the series where we try to figure out where your favorite altcoins could be headed. Today we are looking at Litecoin, and more specifically we're going to be looking at the halving cycles, seeing what Litecoin did from halving to halving and comparing that to what we got in the recent halving back in April. So jumping straight in, let's take a look at what Litecoin's been getting up to over the last few years. We can see that, of course, we had our 2021 bull run, which came after the 2020 halving, and we put in our all-time high for Litecoin at around $415. You can see that was in May of 2021. Ever since, we've more or less been trading downwards since then. You can see we got our little revival at the end of 2021 as well, like a lot of other altcoins, but we basically stayed below $300. So quite a big price discrepancy, $100 of a discrepancy, and ever since then we've been trading down, with the most meaningful effort to try and put in a kind of a bull run or return to these highs took place back in June of last year, more or less a year to the current dates, but we can see that didn't do much of a job of it, and it only came up to about $115, about $300 off the mark. We had a similar type of a rally not too long ago as well, where we came to more or less the same resistance that we saw back in June, July of 2023. And we funnily enough got a very similar rejection soon after that as well. We put in this high and we've basically dropped ever since. Now the fall off has been less severe this time round, which either suggests it's holding up much better now than compared to 2023, how it did in 2023, or we've just got more pain to come and we'll get a similar move just over a longer time frame. Either way, it hasn't played out the exact same. You can see, however, though, that before we got this rally up, we were in a slow upward trend, and we seem to still be within that range, with the only break being the positive move to the upside, with again, sadly, coming back down into this lower range, and now going below the bull market support band, which is something to note as well. While being in this range, we haven't actually seen Litecoin meaningfully dip below the bull market support band, or at least spend more than a couple of weeks below it before getting a push back up to it. So the next few weeks will very much dictate what happens with Litecoin. If we get a bounce off this support, we will most likely come back up to the bull market support band, which is at about $83. And if we don't get a bounce, we will most likely break down below this range, which could bring us down as low as $65, $67. And note the current price of Litecoin is $75. Another quick thing to note before we move into the comparison is that from the low before this high that we got a few months ago, back in April, before this high, we put in from the low to the high a 100% move. Just under a 100% move, but it is just something we will be using as a comparison. So let's get straight into the comparison. Now, looking at 2022, we saw that we did, very much like this halving, get a rally up of about a 133% move from the low before the high, while continuing to trend up. No, this high came before the halving, as it did this cycle. However, it was much closer to the halving here. We can see that it was more or less 2 or 3 weeks before the halving when we got this high. If we zoom back over to the 2020 halving to the 2020 high, we can see it was a few months. It was a few months before the halving. So a small little time frame difference. Also, we had a greater move from this low to this high. We can actually bring this down even lower. Not that it makes much a big difference, but about 136% of a move. Note that we got 93, 94% back in April 2024, current day. So already a few things not lining up. Another thing to note with Litecoin is we started to get this rally up from 2019 onwards, and then we got this similar in size and duration correction from Litecoin, all in the space of a year. It was kind of 6 months. 6 months of going up, 6 months of going down. And this was the year before the halving. If we take a look at what we had the year before the halving, we can see that 2023, we are slowly trending up, but we've already been trending up for a while. And then over the space of 2 months, we get this major correction and then slowly continue to trend up at a much slower rate. So already what's happened before looks quite different as well. So there's not much here that's lining up nicely. There's nothing that kind of fits into place and you could go, oh yeah, we've definitely had that, except maybe this high, but again, the time frames aren't quite right. Now you could argue 2 months of a difference is meaningless, it's kind of negligible, and that's a very valid argument. I would probably agree with you. However, if we take a look at the 2016 halving, we can see that zooming in, if it wants to zoom in. We can see that we get this peak more or less right before the halving. 3 weeks, basically. Same time frame, same exact time frame as we did back in 2024. If we take it how far we rallied up from the low to the high, we can see it's a much more similar 105, 106% of a move compared to the 136 we were getting in 2020. We can also see that we'd been in a kind of range, a trend with Litecoin long before we actually had this rally up that broke above it. Long before what we got in 2024. You can see we started this range a good 6 months before we broke above it. Yeah, you know, we actually started at the lows in August. So 6-7 months. If we go back to, and we take a look at how long we were in this range, we can of course see it was longer. Here it was about 10-11 months. So much longer. But compared to 2020, where we had basically no time at all, we weren't even in this range when we broke above it, I would argue it's much more similar that way. Also, if we take a look at the rally beforehand, bit of a difference again, we can see it's a very sharp incline, very sharp decline. And while the incline we can't really compare too much to, because we did slowly trend up for basically a year here, the sharp decline right before entering this trend is much more similar, is much more comparable to what we've had in 2024. Again, the slow, steady incline we can't really relate to back in 2015, but the sharp decline is definitely something that we have seen before, that we've seen before here. So, if either way, whether you think it's 2016 or 2020, what can you expect depending on which one you think we're most similar to? Well, one way of measuring it is to take the first low that we set when moving into this range and see how long it takes for us to break out of this range. If we take a look, for example, at the 2020 rally where we moved down into this range, we set this first low in March. You can see we take 36 weeks to make the move that breaks us out of this range, and the move that broke us out of this range was the move that kickstarted our bull run. This was the start of our bull run, and this took 36 weeks. So if we take 36 weeks from when we put in the low from this range, we can see that we've already used up that time. 36 weeks was 2 weeks after the halving. We've gone over the 36 time frame by an additional 10 weeks. So we're now at 46 weeks. So if you want to compare us to 2020, you have to ignore the fact that we are now 10 weeks later than where we should be. And I would argue 10 weeks in a 36-week time frame is quite a significant percentage. If we take a look at 2016 and we see how long we were in this time frame for, we can see that from moving from this first low to the high that breaks us out of this range, we can see it was 84 weeks until we finally broke above. 84 weeks is a very long time frame. That's more or less a year and a half. And again, if we project that onto what we saw with this rally that we had starting in August of 2023, 84 weeks brings us out to March of 2025. Again, that's when our bull run would be starting. That's when we would have had 1 or 2 weeks of pure green parabolic price action. And if you want to see how long the bull run lasted in 2016, we can see from the week that we broke out to the high, it was an additional 38 weeks. If you want to project 38 weeks on top of the 84 that we already have, that's bringing you out to December of 2025. Again, I would warn you and say that it's very unlikely anything plays out to the exact time frames that they have done previously. But if you wanted to allow kind of wiggle room of 1 or 2 months either side, so you could say we could peak out from October 2025 to February of 2026, that suddenly becomes a lot more realistic. Especially seeing as how Litecoin in the bull run year last time did have a revival around the end of the year, November time, in the last bull run. So whichever you believe, something interesting to look at. If we do get that bull run, how high could we potentially go? There are again 2 kind of scenarios that we can work with here. If you think we're looking at a 2016 type bull run, and you think because we've had similar moves beforehand, we're going to get a similar bull run afterwards, you're looking at crazy percentage moves. I don't think Litecoin is going to make a 9,000% move this bull run, whichever camp you're in. But you could expect a much stronger move than we've seen before, and we could put in a new all-time high. You can see this bull run, Litecoin put in a new all-time high. This bull run back in 2020, the comparison that we made to the 2020 halving, Litecoin didn't put in a new, well, it did technically put in a new all-time high, but it didn't really do anything new. It just went to the same place and then came back down. So if you think it's more like 2016, you might be inclined to believe that we're going to move somewhere new, so to speak. We're going to go higher than we have before. However, if you think we're in a 2020 bull run, or if you just think Litecoin doesn't have much steam left in it, it's an old coin, there's not much hype around it, you might just expect a return to the all-time highs. Either way, from the halving price of about $81, the all-time high was about a 350% move up. From current prices, that's about a 400% move up. So there is money to be made if you're willing to wait for the long term, potentially. But we could also very easily just see Litecoin break down below this range. So do be aware, it's not just up only from this point onwards. We could very well see a strong correction. And we have seen them before after the halving. This correction here back in 2020 was a 40% drop over the space of a month. Over here as well, while they do look small zoomed out, if we zoom in, they were quite big drops at the time. And again, measuring them from high to low, you're looking at about 25% of a move. Just something to be aware of. So especially if you're taking on leverage, there's a very good chance that you get wiped out. Anyway, looking at the Bitcoin chart, again, I do want to say this is my favorite chart in crypto, just because of how bleak it is. And do remember, Litecoin is a big cryptocurrency, but it just doesn't stand the test of time against Bitcoin, and very few altcoins have. If you go back to any altcoin from these early timeframes, you'll see a lot of them, Dash, XMR, Dogecoin, they all struggle against Bitcoin for at least the majority of the time, whereas Litecoin has struggled against Bitcoin all of its life. Ever since it was launched back in May of 2023, it put in a high at the end of the year in November, and it's never returned to that high. And as the years go on, it gets further and further away from that high. Here you can see how from cycle to cycle, how far the highs drop from one another. This first cycle, Litecoin had a high of 51,000 Satoshis. The next cycle, the high was 25,000 Satoshis. It was cut in half, 50% from that high to the next high. If we go from this high, 25,000 Satoshis, to the next cycle high, we can see that was at 7,000 Satoshis, a 70% cut from the previous high. And it continued to trade down. And again, if you want to measure how far the lows are, the lows in the first cycle were 6,000 Satoshis. And just note, the lows in the first cycle are now more or less equal to the highs in the previous cycle. So if we continue this trend, the highs that we get this cycle are going to be lower than the lows that we got in the first cycle. We went from lows of 6,000 down to lows of 3,000, a 50% drop. And from that cycle, the second cycle to the third cycle, from 3,000 Satoshis, we went down to lows of 1,200 Satoshis, a 60% drop. You could potentially argue that the highs that we get in this cycle could be equal to the lows that we got in the second cycle, because the highs that we got in the third cycle are more or less equivalent to the lows that we got in the first cycle. So you could push that on one and say that the lows in the second cycle are going to be equal to the highs in the fourth cycle. It's not too outlandish of a theory. If you want to take the averages of the moves from the highs to the highs and the lows to the lows, you can see we're projecting roughly a 60% drop from the highs in the third cycle into the fourth cycle, which would put Litecoin at a high of 2,800 Satoshis, 2,900 Satoshis, assuming an average again of 55%, moving from low to low. That would bring Litecoin down to lows of 500 Satoshis. Remember, this can happen while Litecoin is rallying against the US dollar, but most likely Bitcoin is outperforming Litecoin, and so it's still losing value against Bitcoin. So money still can be made with Litecoin, but the data suggests at most periods of time, you're better off having that money in Bitcoin. That is, of course, not financial advice. That's just what history suggests. Litecoin could blow up and return to its all-time highs on its Bitcoin pairs tomorrow. I have no way of knowing for sure. Nobody does. Note that as we enter and exit halvings, we do spend a long period of time trading down. And from cycle to cycle, it has averaged out roughly 90 weeks. And here, of course, we can see we've been trading down for a while. If you want to take an 89-week length period, that would bring you to mid-March of 2025. Again, that does line up with what we saw on our US dollar chart if we're comparing to 2016. We would be getting some kind of a bottom, some kind of a lowering out around March. So if you are a Litecoin holder or you want to pick up some Litecoin, that potentially could be a good time to pick some up. But again, only time will tell. I think that's going to wrap up the video, guys. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike too, that's totally fine. Consider clicking the video up here. Google thinks you want to watch it. And of course, the Google AI overlords are always correct. Or you can click my face here if you want to see other Litecoin or just other altcoin analysis. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Take care and see you in the next one.